dear listeners. Welcome to the first Infinite Library episode of 2025. We wish you a happy new year, hopefully full of lots of time for reading. Today's episode is on Ryan Ruby's 2024 verse essay Context Collapse, a poem containing a history of poetry. Ruby's book is a fascinating and thought-provoking attempt to compress the entire history of poetry into 7 chapters of iambic pentameter, unrhymed poetry with footnotes, starting from ancient Greece and moving through the modernists up to the present-day fascination with AI-generated poetry. Ruby presents what he calls a technodeterminist argument, making the case that the exemplary poets have always been at the forefront of developing trends in technology, economics, and history. John and I had a great time talking about the benefits of such an approach to thinking about poetry and literature, and we end up reflecting on what we've been doing here at the Infinite Library and what we want to do in the future. So this episode kind of ends up intentionally doing a bit of year-end wrap-up, but I think that's the kind of thought Brian Ruby's book can really produce, so I think it's a nice unintentional cap to last year. Brief disclaimer, I tell John in this episode that Ruby's next book is about Wagner and the Ring Cycle. That is not true. He is currently at work on a nonfiction narrative book about Berlin called Ringbahn. Germany heads out there, I apologize. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Yeah, I don't know. Are you ready to do the 80s over again? Jimmy Carter just died. The 70s have never been more over.
Some good books came out in the 80s. Maybe we'll get some good books again.
Hopefully.
Classic literature, like...
I don't know if I can name a book that came out in the 80s.
Yeah, that's... I mean, American Psycho, I guess?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah.
But was that actually written in the 80s, or was that written in, 1991?
American Psycho. I feel like it was 88. It looks
1991.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So not an 80s book. Huh. Wow. Well, I take it back.
See, I thought you were doing a bit where you say, "Oh, all those wonderful books that were made in the '80s," and then there's a cricket sound effect. But I can't. There's got to be some
That's
stuff.
What this has become.
There's got to be some stuff that came out in the '80s, right?
Best books of the 1980s. Best books of the decade, 1980s. On Goodreads, we got *Handmaid's Tale*. Ender's Game. I would have figured Ender's Game was 60s or 70s. Color Purple, Matilda. Name of the Rose.
Oh, Name of the Rose.
Watchmen.
I guess the 80s were Stephen King's decade, now that I think about it.
Yeah, 70s, late 70s, early 80s. It was his real febrile period.
Man, The Alchemist came out in the 80s.
Perfume, Story of a Murderer, Lonesome Dove, Silence of the Lambs.
Confederacy of Dunces.
Yeah, that wasn't written in the 80s, though.
Oh, shit, Blood Meridian.
Blood Meridian? We can't like that anymore, Ben. That's canceled.
All right. I wish I could still like it.
You looking at a copy of Blood Meridian wearing a cowboy hat? I wish I could quit you. How's that for a timely reference?
That's pretty good. As soon as I'm out, I have to read Blood Meridian again. Oh man, the first Red Wall was in the 80s. That's crazy.
Huh, that's another one I figured would have been 60s or 70s, but I guess to get to Redwall, you kind of need you need Lord of the Rings to happen, obviously.
Yeah.
And then like I feel like you need like a decade of like derivative fantasy fiction for some guy to be like, well, what if I did that, but they're like woodland critters
and they eat good? My woodland creatures be eating good. Yeah.
Some of the best Discworld novels were written in the 80s. Okay, there was good stuff in the 80s. Somehow I don't think we're gonna get this much good stuff.
Yeah.
This time for reasons we'll probably be talking about.
Oh man, technically Mysteries of Pittsburgh was the 80s because that was what, like 88 or something?
Like 1989 or whatever.
Yeah. It's just like, it's weird because I have no like concept of the 80s as like a literary decade, I guess. It's like the 60s and 70s I have pretty down, and then I know like the 90s and onwards, but it's like the 80s just feels like, I don't know. It's like I for some reason I don't have a mental image of it.
I genuinely feel like it is because a lot of stuff that came out in the 80s is stuff that like people basically like gave us to read when we were kids.
Oh,
and
yeah.
so it just kind of has this like kind of timeless quality where like I don't like know what like the Discworld novels. I have never thought about the specific year any of the Discworld novels were written.
Right. They just kind of exist.
They've just always been there.
Yeah.
But kind of without like enough historical like in the way that like, I don't know, you can think about like Shakespeare, 1500s. Like you kind of have to periodize it to make sense of why you're reading it and like what is happening in any of the stories in a way that like a lot of this stuff I feel like for us is just, unless it's like, again, like American Psycho, where it's like very much yelling at you like, this is an 80s book. This book takes place in the 1980s. Reaganomics, baby.
Yeah, well, and even that is like a reflexivity, you know, it's like, it's like this was the, yeah.
And also like the 80s, it's weird. I do feel like the 80s is probably the first decade where all our cues for it are primarily visual.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
In terms of like, we think about 80s revivalism the last couple of years, like that has had nothing to do with like literature, really.
Yeah.
It's all about film and music, which is fair. I mean, you know, again, we'll probably get into that a little bit here as we talk about this fine book.
Speaking of context, John, today we're here to read Context Collapse by Ryan Ruby.
This book collapsed my context, Ben.
In a good way or a bad way?
To quote that one guy, he said the Chinese guy about the French Revolution, too soon to say.
Too soon to say. I meant to ask you, John, are you familiar with the "make it new" Chinese saying that was like apparently inscribed on an emperor's bathtub? Because Ryan Ruby, yeah, and does that mean like new every day or something? Like every day should be new?
I'm gonna be real with you, Ben. First time I'd heard of it.
Okay, because like, so we'll get to it. But I feel like, John, I wanted to read this because it came out last year in 2024, and I had heard that it was good, but I also wasn't exactly aware of what it was until I sat down to read it. And as I sat down to read it, I just kept doing the Vince McMahon meme where like he would reference something, I would go like, and then when he gets to Gertrude Stein is like the best modernism writer, I like fell out of my chair because one, that's awesome, and two, he has a great argument for it. And so Context Collapse is essentially a verse essay about reading. It's an argument for reading poetry that's more about the economic forces and the historical forces than whether or not like a poem is good in quotes, although he does talk about that. And so it's a way of thinking about poetry and literary production that I think we do here at the Infinite Library Podcast TM. And it's one that I had sort of been idly thinking about. And when I actually sat down to read this, I sort of was like, I had whatever the feeling of envy is when it's good. Because I was like, this guy made an argument that I know I've been thinking about, but I've not put it so eloquently. And also so I would say like
funnily. I don't know. There's sort of like a sort of like scholarly playfulness to this that I enjoyed personally, being a almost finished grad student. And so I thought it would be good for the show, and I really liked it. But you had said, John, that it sort of collapsed your contexts. Expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of want to echo what you started off saying there. I am, whether or not he would like to be this, I am involuntarily declaring Ryan Ruby a friend of the pod, an adjunct of the Infinite Library Project.
Yeah, we're giving him a fellowship so that he can podcast for us. We can afford to pay him nothing, but the opportunities in networking will be great.
But yeah, I agree with you as well on kind of the thing where it's like, okay, this is, I feel like saying something that you and I have kind of talked around a bit on the show. Almost like there's kind of like almost an anxiety of influence thing, but not entirely, because it's not like this is like a guy we read and like we're trying to supersede him, but more like, I think kind of the weird way that like this book brings up Bloom and the anxiety of influence. And
yeah.
I've also been thinking about that because of friend of the pod, Walt Llewellyn, Black Casebook. Walt, his latest episode heavily references Bloom and anxiety of influence. I feel like, and we'll probably get into this as we talk, but the way anxiety of influence works now, where it's kind of like, because of the volume of production of literature and thought, you know, you're not necessarily competing with the past, you're competing with the present, and with like, we have the infinite monkeys writing on typewriters thing going on right now. How do I make sure like I'm the monkey who finishes Hamlet before one of the other monkeys finishes Hamlet? And not to say that like I could have written this, I'm not a poet. If they said me, they should have said a poet. They should have sent Ryan Ruby. But,
John's like, please, not me. Send a poet.
Yeah, it's cold outside. I don't want to go out. Send Ryan Ruby. But I don't know. I think that I'm noticing a trend that I think we're a part of. I think Ruby's a part of it, which is what I'm calling the great looking around and being like, what's going on?
Yeah, the great, what's the deal? Yeah, it's with this. Yeah.
If I can expound slightly.
Oh, expound.
Yeah, I mean, it's something, again, you and I have talked about both on the show and in private, you know, kind of the state of arts and letters in I guess we'd call it the developed Western world. I don't want to speak too broadly for, you know, the non-Western world, but, you know, developed Western, particularly Anglophone countries, where basically it's, attempts are being made to more or less liquidate art and humanities as going concerns for most of the population. And more or less the way that a lot of people involved in those spaces, particularly like humanities academics, who have, I think, been passively aware of the situation for quite a while, but as like more and more like department closures and things start happening, particularly like state institutions, I think even like a lot of people who were basically operating under like, well, I got tenure because I got my PhD in like 1995. So I don't care about the fact that my discipline is going to be destroyed within a generation because I am within the last generation that is getting to enjoy that discipline being a thing. And now they're like, yeah, if they just close my department down, it doesn't matter that I have tenure.
Yeah, budgets are shrinking, interest is waning, the money is being moved to the STEM fields. Yeah, there's a sort of tightening of the once like perhaps, you know, not exactly huge, but we might say sort of just like reclining on a throneness of the humanities departments. And suddenly it's a folding chair and you're being asked to leave the room, basically. So, but
yeah, I mean, even outside of the academy, which I'm sure we're going to talk more about the academy here as we get into the book, because yeah, Mr. Ruby makes a big deal out of the movement of poetry into the academy in the late 20th century.
Yeah, John, I quite enjoyed, by the way, the discussion of the new critics in that thing, because new criticism was something that SLU trained us on without really explaining why. They just said, hey, kids, don't you want to analyze literature? What if we just paid attention to the literature itself? No need to worry about any of that historical context. And that's how they trained us. And it is one way to train people, but it's also, I think, a way that Ruby doesn't agree with, being that this book is a lot about context and establishing the importance of it to poetry and literary production.
Yeah, I think that this book is very contingent on like kind of the turn back to Marx that a lot of people I'll just say people of our generation have made in the last 10, 15 years. As I think that I remember, growing up wanting to be a writer and kind of figuring like, oh, I'm never going to be rich doing that. But, there are enough like spots that if you, grind and have a little bit of talent, you can find a place where you can make a modest living and more or less be, kind of sealed off from the market and kind of the vagaries of the market. Again, looking back, naive at any time in history, but that is at least like what it felt like. Yeah. And I think that it very much does not feel like that anymore. And again, even people who thought they were very comfortable and very secure are realizing all of a sudden like, I, as an artist, as a scholar, I exist within a social context. I don't actually live in a world of pure thought where I don't have to consider broader historical or market trends, and being like, I don't like it.
Yeah, rudely thrown out of Plato's cave, as it were. But it's like, yeah, economy, history. These are the things that Ryan Ruby is more concerned with talking about in the impact on poetry. Yeah, than the realm of pure thought or pure artistic expression divorced from these things.
Yeah, I definitely was not expecting this book to be, again, I guess like Marxian. I'm not super familiar with Ruby as a writer or thinker myself. After reading this, I definitely want to check out his stuff more. He's someone who, like, I think I followed him on Twitter at some point, but it's just kind of like, oh, this is like a guy book people talk about. I'll give him a follow.
John, I think he's actually working on a Wagner book, is what he said on Twitter. So yeah, I think coming up Ruby in the next couple of years, I think. So
all right, well, I'll be first in line for it. But yeah, I was definitely, I kind of came into this expecting it to be more idealist, I guess. You think history of Western poetry. And I was definitely expecting kind of a more of like I guess kind of a Bloomian affair where we'd be looking at like great and not so great poets and like kind of the tradition, rather than kind of really questioning, the materiality of literary production and the ways that historical forces shape poetry, and again, it's something that I like a lot. I appreciate a lot. I think that this book is, again, I think really coming down in a place that you and I are both at, where it's materialist, but it's a materialism that does not degrade art. I think that where I fall at the very least, it's like absolutely material forces like shape the context in which we think and express ourselves. I don't think that precludes some kind of higher thing happening.
Yeah, and I think too, Ruby even has two senses of materialism here, because he has one that I think is a little closer to Marx. It's about economic forces, market forces influencing poetry, but also there's just sort of like your common everydayness. Like, at one point people realize that they can move the words on a page. And a unit of poetry becomes a page rather than a stanza or a canto. And so like that is a materialism that's not exactly Marxian. It's more just kind of like, these are factors that influence the creation of art, is like what you're working with, the capabilities you have. And so his view of poetry and poets then become like, the really good poets are like really good research and developers, because they're taking advantage of like the breakthrough in media that allows, for instance, moving type on a page. It allows for the consideration of the sound of a word rather than like the word and the sound as being an element of poetry. All of these factors play into it. And as you were saying, John, it's not reductive to me. To me, it's sort of like a fascinating way to look at stuff, especially when the more new criticism, only looking at the poetry itself, just kind of, it's useful to be able to do that, but it sort of seems like a dead end.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, again, I think of the two of us, I'm probably the one. I know that I'm a little less strictly materialist in the Marxian sense, but I think I completely agree that I think that ignoring material context, just getting out into like the realm of idealism, is a total dead end, because then you're just treating every single writer more or less as a sui generis, like individual genius. And I think that, speaking as the Bloomian of the podcast, I think that I think Bloom, despite not being like a Marxist, like I think that the anxiety of influence, like that is like a materialist conception of poetry in a way.
Yeah.
It's this thing where you have, your context, your material historical circumstances, the poets that are given to you to read to influence you, affect you as an artist.
And you have to fight them as well. In
a way that like it's dialectical, you know, in a way that kind of the absolute idealist conception of the artist just does not work on. One thing I found myself thinking about, Ben, speaking of kind of the physicality of the book or of the poem, I guess. So I remember we had a conversation when we were getting ready to do this episode a couple weeks ago, and we were figuring out like getting our hands on the book.
Oh yeah.
And I have been trying to rein in my book buying, because I live in a decently sized apartment, but I share it with another person, and I can't have books stacked on every free surface in my home.
Wall to wall, cask of Amontillado.
There are two cats in this house. Like it doesn't work. So I've been trying to like cut back a little bit. But the library didn't have a copy of this book. I know my library system, even if they had approved the purchase, which they probably would have, it almost certainly would not have been here in time for the episode.
Yeah.
So, I was like, well, is there an ebook version? There wasn't. Ebook version is not slated to come out for another couple months. And I didn't quite understand why, because I mean, obviously at this point, the ebook and the physical book generally come out same day.
Right.
But the way this book is written actually does, or the way it is physically constructed does actually raise a question of what is the best way to do this as an ebook. I'm sure there's a technical term for this. I don't know what it is, but basically listeners, the way the book is set up, if you have not read it yourself, left page is the poem itself. And then there are footnotes in the poem, and those footnotes are on the right-hand page. And
both of which I want to add are written in iambic pentameter, but
yes.
it doesn't rhyme. So
yes, but a lot of times the footnotes will actually end up being longer than the page of verse that is accompanying it on the other side. And so I kind of don't know the best way to do that as an ebook.
Yeah.
Without really breaking up the flow and making it feel very unnatural. Because he does interesting things with the varying lengths of the footnotes versus the main body of the poem, the ways that the footnotes line up with each other. There's only one place where the footnote spills over from one page onto the next, and it is a point where he is listing off a bunch of great poets of color who never got a fair shake by sort of the modernist literary establishment.
I'm especially glad that he almost doubles down on that too, like as opposed to just being like, here's a couple. It's like, it's a big list. Like he's like, here are all these people that did not get their due.
So if we're talking about kind of the materiality of, even again in this case, the materiality of a digital book, a hypothetical digital book. I do not have the ebook. I know there is going to be one.
We're speculating at this point.
But yeah, that's almost like kind of, I think an interesting like peek at the ways that this book is looking at the materialist aspects of literary production. The fact that even when literature is, we think it is this thing that is like digitized and you can go on the internet and you can get a PDF of whatever you want and it's just there. Like there's still a materiality to that. There is still context.
Yeah,
there's not fully collapsed.
Yeah, there's still context. Yeah. And I think too, one of the closest, like the experience of reading this is it's short enough to almost read twice, but my first read through it, I find myself like very pleasurably pinging between the footnotes and the poem because they're laid out side by side. And so the poem, where the footnotes will often add extra content, they'll address like scholarly disputes in the footnotes. They'll even tell jokes. My particular favorite, John, is when he's talking about the Greeks, and there's a footnote for Gorgias, the famous rhetorician, and it says, the footnote just says, "You too can forget truth for 1,000 drachmas." Because you could pay, the sophist would charge money and you'd learn how to speak from them, and they didn't have a conception of truth, and they're all about playing both sides against each other. Again, just a very funny joke that I appreciated being like having a rhetoric background. But also, like, the only way I could, you could approximate that back and forth, like, would be, like, I guess, hyperlinking. So I wonder if they're going to, like, ebook it where you could hyperlink or something like that. Because I feel like the pinging in this, I think, is the important part. And you kind of have to decide, like, how much you want to think about a footnote versus the poem itself. Because sometimes it requires you to just not look at the footnotes to really get the poem, and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, feel like we've given a lot of background. I mean, do we want to actually get into the body of the text a little bit?
Yeah, definitely.
So we start off at the beginning. Something I think that is really interesting with this book is the way that, again, kind of to reflect back on these footnotes, the first section here is a section where there's a lot of verse and the footnotes are very short for the most part. And I think that is because, particularly with like the very first like page or two, it is a lot of Ruby speculating about basically where did poetry start?
Yeah, the very birth of poetry.
Yeah, which is a thing that we don't actually know. And it's interesting the way that this book kind of mirrors the sense that a big part of the story of this book is the way that poetry like exponentially proliferates over time. Yeah. And the way that as you know, the history of literature progresses, we go from a point in time where there's very little poetry, all of it, oral in nature, bound in like not just time, but also space. You have to have a guy there saying it to you.
And he has to sing the poem. He was a singer. Yeah.
Yeah. And then how that steadily increases. And as that increases, we can know more about the world and lives of these people.
Yeah, we can
in a way
have
that-
scholarly disputes about stuff, whereas in the beginning we can only, surmise. And
Yes.
a particular point of the early thing is that when, ancient Greek singers would sort of sing these stories like the Odyssey and stuff like that, there wasn't really a notion of like individual autonomous subject writing poetry. The poet chose the poem for the occasion, and as Ruby sort of underlines, the poet and the audience are one. They're essentially like one relationship, and it wouldn't make sense even to ask like an ancient Greek singer, who sang poetry, like what the meaning of an individual line was. It just was all a thing, or it was all of a piece of like occasion, recitation for that occasion. And, Ruby kind of makes a point of underscoring that because, as you said, John, like along with proliferation, that split happens almost by like chapter 2, which is like a little bit into Greek. It's when people were suddenly thinking about the things they were saying as opposed to just kind of saying them for the occasion, or analyzing them rather than kind of saying them for the occasion.
No, he makes a big deal out of the appearance of like the first person pronoun in poetry.
Yeah, in Sappho. In Sappho.
In referencing the poet as the speaker. In Homer, there's the famous first line of the Iliad, sing goddess, the wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son. Homer is the person saying that, but even he does not know his, he thinks of himself as someone who is channeling a divine force. He's just an intermediary between, the heavens and the community. Whereas obviously there's still a lot of divinity that happens in the work of Sappho, but she is a presence in the work in a way that Homer is not, at least not in a way that is immediately discernible to us as readers, leading to such absurdities as people saying that there was no Homer, that Homer is some kind of composite clown character that never existed.
A jongleur.
That's right. I'm staking my claim. There was one guy named Homer, and he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Well, and and he, if we take Ruby's argument, a lot of that thing that he wrote is sort of like a version, just one version of a story he would tell to many audiences, and he just happened to write that version because it would change depending on the context, on the inspiration, what he would remember. Because the point also that Ruby wants us to take is that poetry is for storing and disseminating information. And so that storage and dissemination mechanism can like change, at least at this time. Like you could tell the story of the Odyssey a little bit differently this time rather than the time we just happened to write it down.
Yeah, I found myself thinking back to some reading I did a couple years ago on the history of the Arab peoples. Let me find the book real quick. Yes. So I read Eugene Rogan's The Arabs, a History a couple years back, and he makes a big deal about the way that Arabic language poets were incredibly important people in, to these nomadic tribes, because basically they did not have the means to have written language. And so poets were both diviners and soothsayers, as well as historians and, newspaper people, basically. They recorded and disseminated information that their community needed to know. And I think that is where Ruby believes the kind of the roots of poetry are. We didn't get into it exactly, but one of the things he asks in the preface is like, what is poetry?
Right.
How do we define it? And he kind of comes down again on this kind of technical angle where it is a particular way of expressing thought and ideas.
And he even says somewhat circularly, a poem is whatever a poet says it is.
Yeah, which I never really fully thought about that. As speaking as a prose writer, I never fully thought about what made a poem, and that was an interesting way to go around it.
Well, and the other thing too in that definition is there always has to be a context. There has to be an audience, and he expands that out to material and economic. But like, if there's no context, there's no poem. So
yeah.
Well, so we can move on through history if we want, as Ryan Ruby does, and touch briefly on. I guess he's still in ancient Greece in chapter 2. And when he talks about Sappho and the idea that suddenly you could actually be a poet and get paid to do this, the idea of like patronage comes in.
The crucial move there is the development of the alphabet.
Yes.
And therefore of writing, like physically writing things down, which takes the poetry out of the realm of the spoken, the immediate, and puts it into the realm of the intellective.
And this is also, John, where me being someone who's trained as a rhetorician can tell that he's read rhetoricians like Walter Ong, who Walter Ong is also defining for media theory, which he also uses. And many people think Marshall McLuhan stole all of his ideas from Walter Ong because he was Walter Ong's dissertation advisor. And then he wrote all his stuff after he read Walter Ong's original research. But as you were saying, John, like the idea that you can write things down suddenly means that you can order them and you can, proceed in a certain way. Walter Ong makes the point that Socrates is one of the first people who could reason as if the ideas were written down. So everybody kind of thought he was like a magician or like somebody who was like preternaturally gifted when he might have just been the first person who could reason as if being written down, is what Walter Ong makes that argument. Some people I know have discounted it, but it's one that comes up in media theory. But anyway, like when we write, then suddenly we have distance between the words and the speaker. And then, you can become a poet. You can get paid by the line. And he also makes the point of like when you would put on like plays in ancient Greece, like the public and the audience are essentially the same thing for one brief instance. Even when at the introduction of the alphabet, the split between the author and the words, I think, are changing, he says, because like suddenly you're divorced from the words you're writing down because you have the ability to do that.
Yeah, I think that what I found myself thinking about here again is another thing I know you and I have talked about before. Kind of this idea of intellective abstraction is like a force in history. The way that, before you have an alphabet, it's very hard to think of words, even if you compose them as being yours. Yeah. Because someone else can just say them. And, again, there was a whole class of people in archaic Greece who they memorized the Iliad and the Odyssey and a bunch of these other poems, and they just repeated them more or less. Like you said, there's always room for changes here and there, but the idea was like, oh, you memorize this whole poem, you can recite it from memory. There's not a sense of ownership over that artwork. You are again more or less acting as a living, radio or TV. But when you can write things down, all of a sudden there is this element of abstraction that allows for the sense of identity, the sense of ownership over words, because you now have a physical thing that you put these down on, and you can put your name on it. You can write your name.
You can say it's yours.
Yeah, you can say it's yours.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, like, oh, you have an identity now as the person. I think about the way, like, this made me think about, because of the theater element. Sophocles wrote tragedies.
Right.
Aristophanes wrote comedies. Homer wrote both the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Epics. Yeah.
But the fact that genre really develops once you can say, oh, Euripides, that guy, tragedy writer.
Yeah, he wrote these. It's individuated. Yeah.
He wrote these, and they are this kind of thing, versus Aristophanes, who wrote comedies, and that's this other sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that, is something that can't develop before people can have the sense of sense of themselves as creators. Because again, before that, you just don't have a sense of ownership over your work. It's all in the divine sphere.
Yeah, the muses are speaking through you. Yeah.
And then that further develops as we go through this book, where we see, in medieval, we have distinct classes of people spring up whose function in society is to do different kinds of poetry. So you have the troubadours, who are sort of involved in like the I guess you'd say like the aristocratic sphere. They do, epic poetry, chansons de geste, stuff like that, versus jongleurs, who are, I guess you would say like the content readers of their day.
They were itinerant clowns as well.
They were medieval podcasters.
I love also the phrase that Ryan Ruby uses so a jongleur is supposed to always say things that other people have written, but some jongleurs would put their own stuff in, and they would refer to them as unscrupulous jongleurs, which is an incredible just like phrase in itself. But yeah, these itinerant sort of clowns who would sort of perform basically, and they weren't exactly in the court. They weren't singing to nobility. They were just kind of out there playing whatever songs that people wanted to hear, as well as like doing tricks and stuff, which I think is awesome.
Juggling.
Also, you had mentioned the influence of like Arabic poetry, and I love the footnote in the chapter on the troubadours where he quotes basically Pound doing like a huge attempt at etymology, and then he goes, most people just think troubadour is from the Arabic word to sing. And it's like so obvious, like Ezra Pound is just like working his ass off in some like sort of European etymology of this word. Oh, here it is. For such an apparently simple word, there is surprisingly little consensus about its etymology. For Pound, the Occitan verb troubar means to find, hence troubadour, or the feminine noun troubares, meaning one who discovers. This in turn may derive from tubare, disturb, troba, style, or alternately tropaire. Scholars who point to an Arabic rather than a Romance origin for the figure, and hence the term, have a more straightforward explanation. It is derived from the Arabic word to sing, which is like, that just seems like it's much more obvious. And it's just funny. You can see Pound trying to like work in like the troubadour is one who disturbs and, creates, which I thought was a nice, sort of contrast there between Arabic influence and, just European.
Yeah, well, I think that that's actually an interesting touch there, because I think that it kind of, again, points to this more materialist way of thinking about the history of these things. Because Pound, I think, he pops up a couple times in this book as kind of one of the avatars of literary modernism. And I'm not a Pound expert by any means, but it would not surprise me that Pound basically wanted to like wall off Western poetic tradition from like the Arab tradition.
But he was also really big on reading, Chinese poets. But if you get into it, he's reading like weird translations of Chinese poets, and he thinks that you can learn Chinese just by looking at the figures, which, is kind of ludicrous, but also like derives from his idea that like a word would contain all of this energy, and like the word would be the thing it's talking about in a way that's like overflowing. And for some reason, when somebody explained Chinese to him, he just thought it was all like that, basically.
Well, there's also kind of an element there, like, again, as someone who speaks and reads a little Chinese, it's kind of the same thing as with Troubadour, where Pound like wanted every character to have this elegant, beautiful, romantic like story that it's telling. And a lot of Chinese characters are written the way they are because more or less like either it's just a transliteration of a foreign word and you've just stuck together a bunch of other words in a way that looks nonsensical if you're like trying to read them just as like the radicals, which are like the individual parts of a Chinese character. Or like there are some characters where there's a radical in there that looks like another word because they're just pronounced the same. So it's just letting you know like, oh, this is pronounced the same as this word that is maybe like has more basic meaning, but it's pronounced like this word, but it has a different meaning in this context. And it's kind of boring, but it's, again, how do you efficiently communicate with other people? It's not by doing highfalutin Poundian artistic nonsense. It's by thinking about the context you're in and doing what is sensible in that context.
Right. And like
it's
yeah.
kind of the same thing with the Arabic translation there, where Pound wants there to be this beautiful reason for why troubadour means true. It's like you said, it's about finding the truth of things. And,
disturbing. Yeah.
The role of the poet is to disturb the calm waters of placid society. And it's like, well, no, they're singers. It's a French, it's a Frenchification of
an Arabic word
for singing. And that's efficient. That is, what makes sense.
Well, and in stuff with Ezra Pound too. If you read Hugh Kenner's The Pound Era, which is a great book about Pound, because he's one of the first guys to take Pound completely seriously and to put a defensive Pound. You read that like Ezra Pound just encountered all of those Chinese characters that are the picture of the thing and thought all of Chinese was like that because of the way that he encountered. So even that understanding sort of derives from like a crucial misunderstanding about like what Chinese is. And Pound stuff is good, but it's also like one of the things in the modernism chapter where Ruby just drops the epigram or not epigram, it's the Chinese character for make it new. That's something like Pound would do, where like he would have a poem and he would just have a Chinese word in there untranslated because it suited his aesthetic principle. So Ruby's kind of taking on the Ezra Pound stuff, even if he's reluctant to like valorize Pound, and in some cases seems to be like kind of making fun of him. So
yeah, I shouldn't speak too much on the Pound stuff because, like I said, I'm definitely not an expert by any means. But there's definitely like there's a certain Western element to like view Chinese writing in particular as like this absurdly poetic thing. And you have like all this stuff where there are a lot of like Western like China watcher types who insist on only using traditional Chinese characters because the simplified characters take out all the art and all the poetry of the characters. And it's like, well, yeah, because they're designed to be learnable and readable by normal people.
Which is the context for them, as we've been saying.
Anyway, that's a me issue. But yes, I like the way that Ryan kind of undercuts. Again, what I like about this book, to kind of get back to the point, is the way that it, I think, simultaneously in doing what it's doing in terms of deconstructing the role of the poet through history, deconstructing the technological context that makes making poetry possible. It is both demystifying, heroizing the poet as a figure, and I think in doing that to like basically any form of artistic or literary production. He's writing about poetry particularly, but you could do the same thing with painting or with prose writing. He has some great stuff about the novel when it shows up on the scene here later that we'll get to. But, he's kind of taking, I think, not just the poet, but the artist more broadly and saying like, okay, this is like a person that like has had a role through history. It's not like this heroic romantic role necessarily. And that means we can deconstruct, we can understand like why this exists, why we think about it the way we do. But then he also does the thing at the very end where he's like, but hey, it's still like worth it to do this.
Yeah. Which I thought that was particularly interesting, that he, rather than kind of constructing a huge defense of why it's worth it to do it, he just sort of says in a footnote, reading and writing poetry is an ethical act. It's basically like what we do as human beings. And as it does, that ending comes after he discusses AI poetry. And he basically just says like, well, and he's quoting from a play, like, if we let AI write our poetry for us, we might as well just say, live, our servants will do that for us, and promptly blow our own brains out. Like, which is like, again, just a nice, succinct defense of it. It's like stated almost plainly rather than, everything else. And that was also like I don't know if I thought it was going to be like he's going to, argue for poetry, and he kind of does, but he also says like, well, we need to look at it in the right context because that's what we have to do now. Basically, we can't just kind of be like, oh, like everything arrives contextless. It all depends on, the technology and the economics. And, some people have accused it of being techno-determinist, I think is what some people have accused Ruby's argument of being, which means like it reduces poetry to only these things. But I think, like, to me, as we were saying, I think it's important to think about stuff that way. One, if you want to do it, because then you can look around and see, like, well, how am I being influenced by doing this? But also, two, it accounts for, I think, why it's still so important. Because, like, yeah, humans are social, economic, unfortunately, but social material creatures. So it's like to sort of ignore this as if we're just in the realm of the forms, I think does the poetry a disservice. And then he also, I think, saves his other great argument for the end, the epilogue almost, but we could maybe save that for later because we're going to jump into that. Yeah, because
that's like a whole thing. I think we're just going to talk about that as a final thing. But I think that to kind of piggyback on what you just said, about kind of this idea of like technodeterminism. What I really kind of enjoy about this book, like not even necessarily on like a technical, like page by page level, but I think that this book is really interesting from the standpoint of just what it is, like nonfiction poetry.
A verse essay. Yeah.
I think that, and I think this kind of plays into some again, broader themes here. About modernity and again kind of this idea of like efficiency in writing and reading. This isn't a work of scholarship. Ruby is not claiming that he is solving a problem here or giving like an exhaustive even like look at what the book is about. Like this is not like an exhaustive look at the history of poetic technical development over time. This is, a slice of that history presented in an engaging and interesting way that, says both something about the writer, something about the history he's talking about, something about the medium he's writing in. I think that there is sometimes, I think that, and again, this is very much like a sickness of the time we live in. Everybody wants like the one like perfect book that's going to like explain basically like, oh, I want to learn about poetry. Let me read this one book that is going to explain all of it to me.
And then I'll be done with poetry after that.
I'll be done with poetry.
Yeah.
And I think that something that I think really part of it is the show has helped me with and just reading more broadly has helped me with. There is value in doing things that maybe aren't exhaustive, that aren't trying to do everything, that maybe are even looking at things in a reductive or even wrong way, because it can elucidate the world further, because it makes you think in a new way.
Yeah.
I think that there is definitely, I can definitely see the critique of this as techno-determinist, but what does reading a techno-determinist account of poetry through history tell us about poetry, about the world, about techno-determinism? These are all interesting questions to ask. None of these things are bad to think about. So I gave Ryan Ruby $15 to read a book that maybe I don't agree with every conclusion he makes in, but why would I want to read a book that just tells me I'm already right?
Right. Yeah. And I think too, he's kind of like, I think he says in the intro, it's mock academic in that he's sort of performing the like review of literature, the addressing counterexamples, but it's done in like a very kind of like playful way. And it's not done in the like, stock, published paper account where you have to like make an incision in the existing discourse with your research and like, account for how you're contributing it. Because I think he is contributing, but I also want to note, you wouldn't really be allowed to make this kind of argument if you actually were an academic. I think that's the other thing this is, as he sort of says, like, I know that I can't make one, I couldn't make an exhaustive argument. And two, I'm making admittedly kind of a Eurocentric one. But, and then, here's why I think it's important. And I think these kinds of sweeping claims, like, you're not allowed to do that. You're supposed to make small claims in academia because you're only really addressed in your proper context, which is, to existing literature. And this kind of claim isn't really allowed. So I think it's cool that he's been able to do this. And as you said, John, I'll give him $15. It's like, and I feel like this kind of like argument it's mock academic because you're technically not allowed to do it. But I think, as he says in an interview, the bigger arguments are more fun. And he does like a great job of actually, like, I think, accounting for everything. So it's not like a flippant argument. It's like, well, what if we looked at everything this way? What would we see? So,
yeah, it's something I think about as someone who's not in the academy. And I sometimes I'm like, oh man, it'd be nice to like be able to claim like expertise in some subject, but it's also I never discovered like one thing I wanted to study that badly. And I think that, if we're thinking about like what maybe are like, I hate to be like, what's the silver lining to the decline of like humanities in academia? It might be that there's more room for stuff like this because you will have thinkers who are not being asked to hem themselves into these very distinct boxes that academia requires you to do.
Yeah.
And again, I think that there's a section of this book, and we can dig into this since we're kind of on the topic. I think Ruby, he's very critical of academia and the effect that it's had on poetry, because academia does think of itself as this sealed off institution where people comment on very small things.
And I mentioned in the intro, he jumps into the academic stuff in talking about the new critics and the language poets. And the new critics, as he says, we're going to consider the poem as if it is a complete artistic object which only speaks to itself, which he calls an act of brazen critical commodity fetishism. Which also is just incredible. Because commodity fetishism, Marx's idea, like if you look at a coat, you're by the virtue of the commodity and paying for it for money, you never actually think about where the coat is from. And it's almost as if the coat has fallen from heaven to you. And so that is in some ways commodity fetishism. And you give money for the coat, and all of this obscures everything that actually causes the coat into being. Where we get the material for the coat, who puts the coat together, how the coat gets shipped to your door. And so he sort of accuses new critics of basically doing the same thing, which is that when we teach new criticism, we only think of the poet or the poem itself. Sometimes we don't even think of the poet. It's just, what is the poet doing? And I was raised on new criticism, having gone to like a prep high school. It's definitely a good way to teach people, but also I think there's kind of a shortcoming in sort of getting rid of all that historical context.
Yeah, well, I mean, he makes a very strong argument, I think, about the ways in which it serves as a way to, like, again, deny, put it bluntly, colonialism, racism, sexism, because when you basically say, like, historical context doesn't matter, when, he draws a line between this and kind of like the modernist poets who really try to like erase themselves from the work, to just have the work stand like on its own as a complete object.
Yeah.
The way that kind of was about denying the context in which it was made, which was a context of like imperial violence, and the fact that, why did Ezra Pound get to write a bunch of baloney about Chinese characters? Well, actual Chinese people were, being peasants.
Right. Yeah. And again, because they sort of arrived to him without context, as if they were just this, beautiful, independent thing.
Yeah. I think that he has a good point there. I think that there's something to be said for the pure criticism, death of the author style of doing things. I think that, again, none of these things are necessarily bad entirely. I always like to think about these different modes of criticism as, how you have like a jeweler's loop. You look at a stone and, they flip through like little different lenses to get different magnifications.
Yeah.
I think that, I've never understood the need to like tie, and again, maybe it's because I'm not an academic. I don't have to like hang my shingle on like any particular thing because I'm an independent critic. I can do whatever I want, and then you people will listen to it, presumably.
Oh, well, because there's also context to this podcast, which is you, the listener. Yeah. So,
please don't collapse on us.
Yeah.
But, you can flip between these different things and you can read things in different ways and, hopefully eventually come to some kind of synthesis.
Yeah.
But there's no reason to totally throw any of these out. You can read a poem in its historical context and you can read it as a sui generis cultural product. And both of those lenses can give you interesting things to say. You can choose to privilege one of those over another. I feel like I probably privilege the historical critical model a little more. But maybe in the future, once we've achieved full communism, people will go back to doing new criticism and it'll be better because there will be no more suffering.
Yeah, well, we can go back to our idle time. I will say, though, Ruby points out that, like, the fact that this was happening is because, historically, this is the 60s and 70s. We're approaching the onset of context collapse. So this is where, like, this sort of title begins to creep in because, like, as he says after he was mentioning it, an act of critical commodity fetishism so brazen, one wonders how it achieved hegemony until one remembers that at the time, media was entering the context of no context. And the page, like Oakland and television, had become a place where there was no there. And no there, by the way, is Gertrude Stein quote, because he sort of defends Gertrude Stein in the previous chapter as being like the most important modernist figure, outside of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. But the phrase "there's no there" is great, and she originally said it to refer to going back to her hometown after it had changed, and just said, "Well, there's really no there." Like, so it's all different. It's not what it once was, and so in the language poets, he basically makes the argument that they were all academics. So they're all writing poetry just basically for themselves. And with language poets, it's all just about like the poem itself and like, playing with words on the page and stuff. And the sort of poetic voice that gets established as a result of the workshop and not, the concerns of the modernists or the other poetry that he's been talking about.
Yeah, he draws a little bit of a line, he talks about the foundation of the first writing workshop and the ways that like is about professionalizing the writer. And, that leads to a lot of this stuff kind of becoming for itself. Yeah. It's something that I it's this added layer of abstraction in a way, we're again, as we near context collapse, abstraction just continues to abstractify. I found myself thinking when we got to that, again, kind of as I was thinking about these broader questions of abstraction, something that we were talking about before we started recording was the Redwall books.
Yeah.
And I think a lot about kind of the interesting way like genre develops through time and the fact that you almost need like a certain level of like intellectual abstraction is needed to write a fantasy novel because you have to be able to imagine a world that isn't real and isn't connected to our world in any way,
but it has its own like coherent logic somehow.
Yeah. But that logic cannot be like something that you are like inside of, or you are, but only as an observer.
Yeah.
So you can't be like too tied up. Like there's obviously echoes of that and things like, the chivalric romances or Thuriana, but other worlds and those stories are always crucially connected to this one. It's always the fairy world or it's heaven or hell. Whereas, now we have the Redwall books, which aren't, to my understanding, like high magic stuff. Like everything is relatively grounded, except that it's about talking animals.
And it's also, as some have said, speciesist, because there are some animals that wear the white hats, and then there are other animals that wear the black hats. And Brian Jakes like sort of doesn't want to confuse the two. So as soon as you like see a mouse, you're like, the mouse, that's a good guy, but a ferret and a stoat, those guys are evil. And that's like basically the rules of Redwall in a nutshell.
Yeah, but it's not like exactly a fable either. It's not like these are totally allegorical figures. You know, it's still supposed to be a world that has a logic outside of being purely symbolic.
And there's like, you know, as you said, Arthurian, there's quests, there's horrible despots, there's like secret, you know, orders of mice that do tasks. There's like abandoned ruins. There's a lot of like, carryover from fantasy and Arthurian stuff, but it's not, allegory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now that I'm thinking about it more, you know, Ruby directly makes this argument, actually. He doesn't make it in the context of fantasy books, but he talks about the crucial thing that made the novel suddenly appear and kind of supersede poetry is the fact that people realize, like, oh, I don't have to lie and say that, like, I found a manuscript. Like, I don't have to pretend that this is a different thing. I can just write a story, and it doesn't have to have the same, like, air of poetic tradition or history or pretending, you know, I
found objects. The
commodity novel, that's a new thing to me. I haven't read any of those, and I'm sure I've heard of it before, but this is the first time I ever like really processed it. That actually sounds fascinating. Yeah,
these are novels that are from the perspective of like sentient money and like objects.
Well, it's the story of like a dollar bill, and like the different people like it quote unquote sees is like it's circulated through an economy. Which just, I don't know. I mean, it is definitely like capitalist, but it also sounds very interesting.
Yeah, especially since it's like a niche thing. But as you were saying, it sort of comes into being like at the time of, when the novel starts.
Yeah. But I found that interesting because I think that one of the core parts of this book is kind of looking at how poetry goes from being divine, crucial to like the life of a human society, to being flotsam, to being, so I don't want to say trash. I don't think he ever quite gets to that point, but like, how do we go from sing goddess, the wrath of Achilles, to, you know, a bunch of like guys who want to be Elon Musk and like V-neck t-shirts trying to figure out how they can make a chat bot, you know, write sonnets for them.
Right.
Like, how do we get from one thing to another? And I feel like a big part of that story is kind of, I mean, it's all the stuff we talked about. It's about technology. It's about
abstraction.
Abstraction. It's also just kind of about like the loss of hold that tradition has. Again, the fact that like all of a sudden people who write novels can just be like, oh, I don't have to like put my story into verse. I can just write it, and I can just say I wrote a story. Or like the language poets being like, oh, well, we're not going to do things exactly that, like, maybe not. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Let me say this. So, or like he talks about Walt Whitman developing blank verse, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, we need like a new form of American poetry. So we're just going to throw away all the rules because we're detaching from like this broader tradition or, you know, partially detaching from it.
And importantly, we can move type on the page. As he says, Whitman was a printer's devil. So he like knew that you could arrange type a certain way. But anyway,
Yes, but it's kind of this thing where it's kind of the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility. Like that happens with the printed word well before it happens to any of the other art forms. In a way that like it almost ends up eliding the fact that happens.
Yeah. Well, and he quotes Benjamin to talk about. Benjamin points out that like
in German.
Well, but he's like advertisements were playing with typography before novels were. And they were like, he quotes them and saying like they like the print was like obscuring the sun in some places because it's like huge blaring letters that like eventually the novel would do, but it hadn't yet at the time.
Yeah. You know, I again, maybe it's because I read The Dialect of Enlightenment this year, but I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which like the process of like modernity is kind of like all tradition, all, you know, all things that are solid melting into air, and the ways in which that is both like horrifying, but also like can be liberating. And I feel like that's like the tension in this book is like the power of the poet and of poetry gradually receding as poetry becomes easier and easier to produce, as the poet's role in like history is changed by technological and market forces.
Yeah.
But it's also liberating because all of a sudden anyone can be a poet and anyone can express their thoughts and put them out into the world and, you know, try to find that like sense of immortality in a way.
Also, when he starts talking about the amount of poetry that's written every year, there's sort of like a dizzying vertigo effect
Yes.
where it's like if everybody can write poetry, then almost nobody can keep track of how much poetry is being written. And he was like saying most people are writing poetry rather than reading it at this point.
Yes, which is a problem.
Yeah.
To be frank. Read poetry if you want to write poetry. Stop.
That's the infinite library commandment. Yeah, read poetry if you want to write poetry. Well, I also like how he gets to the AI stuff because he's talking about like when towards the end of the bit about the academics where suddenly like the speaker and the context are gone from language and language is just this thing itself that's just there. And he says at one point, the time had come to wonder, why write at all? If language is a subjectless process rather than an intersubjective one, a counter-communicative flow of parts through decontextualized language zones, rather than a communicative relay informed by a discrete social context, an algorithm rather than a message, wouldn't it be better now that the means were available just to automate it? And then the next chapter is enter AI. It says exit the well-wrought urn, enter AI. Yeah. So like, and we get to that point by like, again, abstracting away from these things so that suddenly it's just the language itself. And he talks about like, yeah, the first computer written novel and that kind of stuff. And he makes a crucial point here, which is that like, if an AI writes a poem intended for a human, it's still okay. But if there's two AIs sending poetry to each other, then that's essentially death because neither of them can be really impacted by the message that they're receiving. So it's just like energy moving around and nothing has actually happened.
Yes. I feel like there is something I struggled with a little bit coming to the end of this book.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the broader issue I've noticed with, again, a lot of writing like this, where it is very like, it's great at diagnosing. It's great at saying like, hey, have you guys noticed that there's a problem? Have you noticed that, you know, there's all this history and that it's led to this? And I don't know, again, sometimes I get mad at myself for saying this because I know at some level, like, I can't expect this of myself, so how can I ask it of other people? But sometimes I'm kind of like, okay, well, you've told me all this. What do you want me to do with it?
Yeah, yeah.
What am I supposed to be doing with this? And I'm more charitable to Ruby because, again, he's not like an academic. He's not selling this as like, oh, here's how we like get poetry back or anything like that. But it does kind of leave me. And I think that this is, you know, critique that can be made of our show too. It's like, well, you've added all this context. You've explained all this technological stuff. I finished this book and I'm still living in I'm still seeing all these man-made horrors beyond my comprehension. There's still no poetry after Auschwitz, which is a line that I'm surprised didn't show up in this book. Maybe Ruby's not an Adorno fan, but you know, it's one of these things where I never quite know what to do with this stuff where it's like you're diagnosing a problem and then that's just where it ends.
Well, and I think that epilogue might have something to do with that, but I do agree, John, that I was sort of like, you know, you're sort of carried along in this like dizzying rush of like scholarship and argument. And then it just kind of like ends in a really dark place. And then there's like an epilogue, which is it's a tornado, which I believe he mentions in the chapter on troubadours is like the tornado is meant as this sort of like, here's what I want the singer to tell you. Like it's the sort of address. It's like the pointedness of something. And in the epilogue, he basically just sort of imagines like all of the apocalypses that we think are coming are going to come. They're going to come. Who would it matter for? And he talks about like, it wouldn't matter for the ice caps that melted. It wouldn't matter for the, forests that become deserts. It wouldn't matter for the water to rise. It might matter for the animals who are experiencing pain and going extinct, but it would matter to us. And then he sort of says that like, basically the true context of poetry is trying to fight against death, because for poetry is the light of the future coming into the present, which is a line that he takes from Emerson, I think. And that to sort of read and write poetry is to sort of like, in a very, I would add, John, Bloomian way, a struggle against death.
Writing against death.
Yeah, exactly. And that is where he comes down on at the end. And I found that to be like kind of sobering in a way that I liked, not in like a way that's like, oh, yeah, who cares? But it's like, okay, so that's kind of what it comes down to. And sure, like we can, give context to things, which I think is good, even though in some cases it may be fruitless, or we can write our own stuff. But I think kind of like reckoning with that, I think is kind of what he maybe wants us to do. And it's sort of left up to us to kind of take that how we will.
Yeah, I picked that up. Again, it's not a subtly made point.
Right. He just kind of says it. Yeah.
Which is fine. That's what a tornado is supposed to do.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be subtle. It's supposed to be fairly blunt. Sometimes you have to be blunt.
Right. And like, here's what this is addressed to. Also, like, he actually rhymes in the tornado, which is as the rules allow. But anyway, yeah.
So like I get that, and I can, again, as the Bloomian of the podcast, as you watch my jowls slowly melt off my face as I turn into a curmudgeonly old Jewish Jabba the Hutt type figure.
You get more and more fed up. Yeah. So.
I don't know if I agree that this completely, like, I don't know that this doesn't really square the circle for me of the material issue of poetic production.
Yeah.
Like, to me, this almost feels like kind of a retreat into the romantic, which I don't even necessarily hate, speaking as John, but as someone who read this book and is like following its argument, it kind of feels a little bit like, well, you've just demystified all this stuff. Then at the very end, be like, hey, we just got to remystify this.
Yeah.
And crucially, we have to remystify in a way where no one's reading any of this, and no one's making any money or like able to like live doing this.
Yeah,
is a little bit frustrating.
It definitely felt like a what's the word, like a third act that just kind of came out of nowhere. Like, not exactly Dave's like Machina, but suddenly like there's a turn into the less material. Even though he does talk about all this materialist stuff in that tornado, it's still, I would argue, like, as you were saying, John, I agree, romantic, like capital R romantic.
Like, my thing is that the central idea of the last like third of the book, we'll say, is, I mean, it's the theme through the whole book, but when it shows up, he does the title drop basically when he talks about context collapse. And it's the idea basically that like with the internet in particular, all of a sudden, like, poetry no longer like exists within like a sphere that like it can be contained and understood within, and like no like human activity is anymore. Like, context collapse is apparently like it's a term that was developed to refer to the thing that happens when like people from outside of like a space online suddenly find that space and they don't understand what people are talking about. It's like I imagine like someone like stumbling across like B on 4chan or like a trans meme subreddit, And, not saying those things are like morally equivalent, but just like they're things that like if you aren't part of those communities, like they're going to look very strange and even frightening.
And you're going to take you're going to take a position where you like, either like shame it or like, misunderstand
you
or
troll,
like,
or
troll,
you intentionally misunderstand it. And so that's kind of like the context. Like, I think that's absolutely right. In terms of like, we see that that's kind of what happened with, I think, a lot of social media platforms in the last 10 years is like you put everyone in one space. The market requires you do that to make any of these ventures make profitable sense. But then you have a bunch of people who don't want to be around each other, like rubbing digital shoulders more or less. And all of a sudden, like people are seeing stuff they don't understand, that they don't want to see, that they find upsetting.
Right.
And it just leads to like a progressive arms race of like people being aggressive and pointlessly cruel and stupid,
rage bait.
And just kind of the proliferation of more and more stupid, meaningless content to feed like these rage based algorithms. And the rage isn't quite here, but it's kind of the thing where poetry has proliferated to such a point where, again, like you said, more people are writing poetry than are reading it.
Yeah, by a huge, staggering number, given the stuff he mentions.
Yeah, there's also the bit about like Rupi Kaur, who's one of like, probably like 3 people who actually makes a living writing poetry. But crucially, the poetry doesn't matter. What matters is that like she posts it in a way where like it can be commodified by Instagram and Meta to like mine data from her followers.
That's a pretty elegant footnote because it comes down. Well, I don't want to read the whole thing, but here it is. Just this section. The exception's name is Rupi Kaur, who, along with maybe 2 or 3 other Insta poets, is one of the few people on the planet who are actually able to make a living exclusively from writing poetry, if you can call it that. What she ultimately provides is not certain words in a certain order, even if these words are later printed on paper and become best-selling books, nor even banner and space for the products promoted by her account, nor even ticket sales to her world tour, but rather the attention and behavioral data of her millions of followers, readers of Instagram itself and its owner Meta and their B2B clientele. They are therefore known to Instagram's execs by a much less vaunted title, content creator. So, they're serving that stuff rather than, certain words in a certain order or poet audience.
So I guess I'm rambling a little bit and I feel like I may be losing my point a little bit. So I'm going to hone back in on what I'm trying to say here. Speaking as someone who writes, it is a big problem that there are so many people who want to write, but don't want to read, who want to, in fact, play video games and watch YouTube videos and doom scroll on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever. And I don't think that basically just saying like, again, kind of taking this romantic tack where, oh, well, you're doing it for you. Like you're doing it like for your personal existential experience. I don't think that is actually up to the task of explaining why this is worth it in the greater context he has provided.
Yeah.
I think that, again, that is an argument you can make. It's even an argument that I can be amenable to as someone who writes, and most of that writing has never seen another person's eyes. I can be amenable to that. But when you put it in the context of like the history of poetry and stuff like that, to me, that just means that like, well, eventually all this stuff is just going to be deleted when like a server farm burns down.
Yeah.
And it might as well have not existed. Which is true to some degree, eventually, regardless. At some point, the sun is going to go supernova and all of Keats will disappear. And let me tell you, I will be looking down from the realm of the forums and I'll be very sad. But I'll be able to go see the real Grecian urn at that point, so who cares?
Well, isn't that also kind of the argument he makes? Like, from the perspective of that, it's like, well, why do anything? And I think he's sort of saying, like, I think having an audience is the important part for this book's argument. But also, the idea that we're doing it even though that, in from that view, nothing really matters.
Yeah, I mean, again, I get that, and I again generally actually kind of agree with that. Again, writing against death.
Yeah,
but you go through all this trouble of explaining, like, oh, the poet has a social context. The poet has, a role in society. The poet, only is a poet in relation to society. And then you're like, well, actually, that's all well and good, but whatever, just do whatever you want because we're all going to explode someday, probably soon. It doesn't feel like an elegant way to end this. Like you said, it feels like a left turn. It feels like he's kind of like I said, to me, it feels like a bit of a retreat, and it's a retreat from like the just nihilism of like, oh yeah, like capital's just going to liquidate all this stuff, and eventually there's not going to be any poetry because you can't sell it to people. Which I don't necessarily even agree with that either. Right? It's just like, it's kind of the technodeterminist version of this.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess like what I'm kind of making an argument for why this book isn't technodeterminist, because he backs up from that. But it's still kind of this thing where it's like, well, I'm still just left with a problem and no satisfying, not even solution, but like no satisfying, like potential for a solution. Because I think that an individual romantic thing like is always not going to be a solution.
Right.
And he kind of says a little bit, because he says at one point that like a revival of like poetry as like a going concern in society would require like a full restructuring of society.
Right. Yeah.
And I almost wish he talked more about that.
Yeah, that would have been an interesting tack, because he does gesture towards that and the sort of individual atomization versus collective audience poet relationships. It's like, yeah, we would have to imagine, society differently to get that.
Yeah. Like, again, it's something we've talked about with the show, where I think what we kind of hope the show can be like, I don't think either of us think like, oh, we're going to, we're going to overtake, what's a big podcast right now? We're not going to be Joe Rogan doing this. We're not going to get millions of listeners or subscribers, but, the hope is that we can cultivate, an audience of people who like what we do, who want to have conversations about books, who just want to enjoy literature as like kind of I guess you would say like a spiritual pursuit. And in doing that, kind of try to create like a small, like, bulwark of something against the overwhelming entropy of the universe.
Right.
To put it in both humble and grandiose terms.
But it's all about both of those. Just balancing both. That's the goal.
But I think that, like, for me, what I there's a line he has where it's the kind of dream of the liberal modernist world was like a journal for every community, that there'd be a magazine for every interest group and community in society, and they would all kind of like subconsciously like basically elect people to be their like spokespeople to write in these magazines and like do poetry for them. Yeah. And I feel like there's kind of this thing where that's still probably the best case scenario, but it kind of requires us to get rid of the profit motive.
Right, which is extremely ingrained. Oh, and also I wanted to add one slight thing to what I said for the ending, because I do think, to me, the last thing about the ending, when he talks about the light of the future addressing into the present, like, that seems to me to be a hopeful note that is not in, as you were saying, John, the bulk of the verse essay, which is largely kind of not exactly despairing, but like pessimistic, we'll say, or like sort of like almost like, well, technology is influencing. And I think, like, to me, and this also is romantic, it's like, yeah, the idea of like, if I am writing a poem to an audience now, I'm engaging in hopefully a hopeful act. Like it's the idea that like it's something somebody will read maybe in the future, maybe when I'm gone. And even that is a future that, you know, we can sort of talk about how like nobody talks about the future anymore. I think he's kind of saying like even doing this is a hopeful thing. Is it romantic? Yes. But I think like that's kind of the what is it, the retreat that he pulls out is like, well, it is hopeful that I'm doing this at all. So maybe we can think about the future in a slightly more positive way, given that I have to get through like, you know, every natural disaster. Like because he lists like every natural disaster in the beginning of that tornado and then comes down at the hopeful end. And so, but yeah, I think like, as you were saying, John, getting rid of the profit motive, the hope that you can create a literary community, or the hope that you have an audience of things that appreciates your work. Like that's, I mean, I don't know. I ran a zine for a while. I was definitely on that hope kick for a while. So. Yeah,
I mean, I feel like, again, I don't have like, I can't say I have like a solution to any of this, but to me, like any solution kind of starts with being online less.
Yeah, definitely.
And like actually like choosing the things you care about and doing them and like trying to be in community with other people who do them.
Yes. Yeah. You know, I would say yes to that.
Not to like brag or anything. And again, I think we're actually basically agreeing with Ruby on this point, even while again, my issue is less with the content and just more the way that like the argument kind of comes into the book.
Yeah. Just suddenly at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, like this show, you know, this is a thing that we don't make any money doing this, you know, again, inshallah, maybe someday, but at the moment that's not in the cards, and we're not asking anybody for money, but this is a thing you and I chose to do, you know, I mean, partially just because we wanted to talk to each other more, and partially, you know, again, like if we didn't do the show, like, would I spend this time reading more? Would I spend this, like, what would I spend this time doing? The like way that I am being pushed to spend this time by like all the like broader macroeconomic forces in my life is look at phone.
Right.
And the fact that we are like consciously choosing to do this instead of look at phone is important.
Yeah.
And I think that, if any like improvement in kind of this like superstructural stuff, I think kind of starts with people consciously deciding to stop looking at phone.
Yeah, stop looking at phone. I think being intentional. And I think, like one of the reasons we wanted to do this, because I think like whenever we would meet up in the same place, I feel like we'd have good conversations about stuff we were reading. And I was like, what if we just kept doing that? It's like, it seems like a good thing. I enjoy doing it. So like, why not just keep doing it?
And again, maybe this is, again, the same thing Ruby's saying, where it's like, maybe we will never have, you know, even 1,000 listeners. I hope that's not I hope we do have it. I hope we have 1,000 listeners when this episode comes out. But even if we didn't, this can still be a meaningful project. Because
this feels like the true end of the season episode now that we're talking about it, because I feel like we're being very reflexive and thinking about what we're doing, you know, which I think is the mark that this book is very good, because I feel like a book can get you doing that, and you don't, I mean, sure, the diversions and the, you know, are good too, but I think a good book like this actually gets you kind of thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Absolutely. You know, I definitely want to say, kind of on a like Statler Waldorf critic level, this is a good book. Like, this is absolutely something that's like worth picking up, worth reading. Give Ryan Ruby your $15, or get it from your library or whatever. This is absolutely worth reading. You can, it's like not a long or arduous read, even if you're someone who doesn't read a lot of poetry. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, it's fun. I think, you know, we're critics, we're doing criticism, so we're always going to talk about the stuff that doesn't work too. But you know, it's we have finite time to read, but you know what? None of these books are going to solve all our problems. So you might as well read what you want. Read what's good. I don't know. This book is kind of this book is I'm feeling very all over the place, kind of emotional.
Well, I like what you're putting down, John. Yeah, reading is good. It's it's a struggle against death. So reading against death. So
well, let me take a stab at maybe saying what I think I'm trying to say, if you don't mind.
Oh, of course, do it.
So I mean, it's one of these things we look at this book. This is a we'll say broadly speaking, this is a materialist history of poetry.
Yeah,
I think a lot about the ideas of historical materialism as deterministic, as technodeterministic, and I think about the ways in which the world we live in, it really does feel like everything is determined. It feels like these forces that we are subject to are so overwhelmingly huge. There's a reason, people talk about capital like it is Cthulhu, or like it is the Gnostic demiurge, or it is like Hell 9000. That it's this inhuman, impersonal force that just is destroying everything. Blah 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 blah. And on one level, it's true. Like again, like we said, reading this book, not saying it's all about capital, but it's historical material forces do matter.
Yes,
they do shape our lives, but there is also always like this element of contingency that is sometimes hard to see. But I think about to circle back to the troubadour thing, where that word comes from. In another world, whether for any number of reasons, that word doesn't take off, and it's a chansonnier. It's been a long time since I took French. That's the word they use, which is the more like direct, like French, Latin singer.
Yeah,
that could have just happened. There's no particular reason it had to be this word over another word. There are always like points where, whether you want to call it free will or random chance or whatever, even within kind of these historical forces, like there is always room to maneuver, even if only a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that there are limits on that, but sometimes I think it's very easy. I think a lot of people anymore fall into a very pessimistic mindset where it's like, well, there's nothing I can do personally. There's nothing I can do individually. And I can't, like, the forces are not right for me to act collectively. So I'm just going to rot and feel bad. And I've definitely felt that way before. And I think that obviously wouldn't be like moving towards some kind of collective, hopefully like solution to these problems, but also sometimes it can be good to just do things that are maybe not going to destroy capitalism. But hey, spending less time just looking at the news on your phone, that's not going to not destroy capitalism.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well said, John. And I think the metaphor that I remember reading from some communist philosopher was like, it's sort of like a dog is chained to a post, where it's like, yeah, you can move around a little bit, but there is some material clamp, we might say, on what we do. But I think that's, not reason to throw in the towel and just sort of give up.
I think that we can make spaces where art still matters. Again, is it going to make anybody a bunch of money? Is it going to free any of us from the constraints of the market? Is it going to revolutionarily change society? Probably not. But it can still be good to have spaces where things like beauty and love and art matter. And I guess I'm agreeing with Ryan Ruby. Shout hymns to the sun, because what else are you going to do?
Yeah, these are ethical acts.
Yeah, I think this is one where also you'll get a lot more out of it if you pick this up yourself and you read it, because the context is very important. We can talk about every section individually, but reading it as a whole piece is A, very breezy, very fun, but B, you're going to get a lot more out of it than having us kind of just talk about chunks with you.
Well, and so I think too, like I would say also, as John said, full commendation on this one, commendation. And yeah, I don't know. It just kind of really got me thinking about this stuff. And I think that's the important part. And sure, I'd love to go over the Gertrude Stein section because side note, William Gass loves Gertrude Stein, and he's one of the first people I read where he was just swinging hard for Gertrude Stein. There's a story where he describes running across the quad at night after reading a Gertrude Stein sentence, which is like the most William Gass thing I've ever heard. And so it was nice to see Ruby pull for Stein in that chapter, but you can read that on your own, listeners. I think definitely give this a read, and stay tuned for basically the rest of our schedule. Because we've got some good stuff lined up, and we posted it on the socials, so look out for that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a fun spring going into the summer. And looking forward to reading and talking and doing all that good stuff. Well, listeners, until next time, Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir.